Hi, Laura. Let's take a look at this new set of essays about the Olympics. That's the first one. Here's what you wrote. It has been a topic of many debates whether the Olympic Games have any significant value in the present century. In my opinion, the Olympics do have historical importance. However, its significance has been decreasing over the last decade due to the environmental and economic issues, which will be discussed in this essay. Okay, fine. They do have historical importance. Okay. Well, you haven't. Did you really tell us your perspective here? I mean, do you agree or don't you agree? You tell us that it was historically important, but its significance is decreasing. Okay, so is it or is it not important? I mean, it feels like you've kind of sidestepped answering this question. Let's see what you do in the following paragraphs. Firstly, it is important to note that the Olympics is a valuable national heritage that has been passed on over several human generations. Thus, the event is meant to unite people from all around the world. All right, well, while the words you use are very nice, I don't believe that they are entirely relevant here, and I'll tell you what I mean. Let's see. Valuable national heritage, that doesn't really quite work because, as we know, the Olympics are an international event, so I don't see how this makes sense here. I don't like the expression several human generations. We don't call them human generations because, I mean, we wouldn't refer to them as anything else. They're just several generations. Do you know what I mean? Like, you would never say several, like, dog generations or several cow generations. So don't understand this particular distinction here. I would have just said several generations. And then this doesn't make sense to me. Thus, the event is meant to unite people from all around the world. Because the thus is kind of showing us that this is a conclusion, this is a result of the previous statement, and that doesn't really make sense. So while the language itself is really nice, when you kind of look beyond that to gauge and understand some meaning, that meaning is not entirely clear. Okay? So, nevertheless, in the recent decades, the meaning of the games has pivoted towards its financial side. I don't really care for that word pivoted here. To exemplify, rich and developed countries such as the US and Canada have money and resources to fund their athletes to train for the Olympics, whereas developing countries or the countries with poor economy, for example, Iran and Kazakhstan, cannot afford such spending. Therefore, the competition loses its value since no matter how talented a sportsman is, the country's funding plays a decisive role. Okay, what does this paragraph tell us? What's the central idea? Remember that your paragraphs need to have a central idea, and that central idea needs to be clear throughout the paragraph. And here, quite frankly, I'm lost. So here in the beginning of the paragraph, you told us that the Olympics are something that have been passed through generations and they're very important. Then you tell us that the Olympics have become really kind of financially based. And so I don't understand what your point is here. What are you telling us? That the Olympics are important or that they are not important? Neither idea comes through here. All right. So I kind of feel like, I'm not sure what I feel like. It's not a clear paragraph. Your idea is not clear here. Moving on. Secondly, even though hosting the Olympics is a huge honor for any country, it also carries a considerable environmental and economic burden. Preparations for the event, the Olympic flame, transportation of the guests, and related activities produce a huge amount of greenhouse gas emissions, which has a detrimental effect on the environment. Furthermore, it also negatively affects local economy because the hosting country needs to meet the necessary requirements of the Olympic Games. This is most commonly represented as a rise in taxes or inflation. Therefore, the importance of this event greatly diminishes in comparison to its consequences. Okay, fine. This was much clearer. Okay, here you're clearly talking about the negatives, but we're going to talk about that in a minute. To conclude, although the historical meaning of the Olympics cannot be overlooked, its value has become less and less important due to a number of significant issues mentioned above. Okay, let's see. So, like I said, let me rephrase that. I understood this body paragraph. This made sense to me. This definitely did not. I didn't know what you're trying to say. I didn't realize what the central idea was. It was very difficult to follow. And I liked your conclusion because things finally made some sense. The problem is that this idea that you had here in your conclusion, as well as this idea, they have to be clear throughout the essay. It's not enough to just make it clear in the introduction and clear in the conclusion. It has to be clear throughout the body as well. So I already told you I didn't understand this paragraph. And then in this paragraph, I didn't feel like you were talking about why the Olympics are no longer important. Instead, it just felt like you were saying the negatives about the Olympics. And that's a totally different issue. Just because you talk about the negatives of something, it doesn't mean that that something is not important. And that's what you were supposed to be arguing here. All right, so that really wasn't clear. I understand that you tried to tie it at the end of your essay, but it really didn't work. Okay? So while the language you used for the most part is quite nice, vocabulary and grammar are pretty well controlled, in terms of coherence and cohesion and task achievement, you would find this essay having some problems. Okay? For the reasons that I've already mentioned. So with that, I want to move on. Before I do, just so that you don't really have any questions at all, this idea of no longer important. What do we mean? The Olympics are no longer important. Why would somebody say the Olympics are no longer important, and in what way? You said that there's a huge burden. Again, that doesn't mean that they're not important just because they carry a huge economic burden. So prove to me why they are no longer important. They are unimportant. Okay? Because somebody could then argue, well, if they have such a burden, such an economic burden, maybe they do so because they are very important, or maybe because there are some wonderful financial gains made out of this. Do you understand what I mean? So you didn't follow it all the way through. And like I said, I just felt like you were just talking about the negatives of the Olympic Games, but not this idea here of no longer being important. All right, so now let's move on to your other task. Okay, so let's look at your task 1. The bar chart gives information about the sales of brown and black leathered, you could have just said leather without the ED, footwear in 9 different European countries in 2018. Overall, the most traded shoes were made of brown leather. However, in Hungary, Italy, Belgium, and the UK, the black version was more popular. The highest sales of the former were in Poland, in contrast to Belgium, where brown leather was in the least favor. Okay, fine. In terms of boots, it never said boots, careful. In terms of shoes made of brown leather, no material there, get rid of that. Germany, Poland, and Hungary accounted for its most sales, for the most sales, with around 130, 140, and 125 shoe pairs, respectively. Careful, we're not talking about hundreds, we're talking about thousands. Look, don't forget to include those zeros, because this then all of a sudden becomes inaccurate. You can't use whereas like this. You have to connect 2 sentences together with whereas. If you want to use a sentence like this, instead you could say in contrast. In Belgium, this number barely reached 10,000. Give me 1 second. Let me count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay. Regarding black leather, again, no ED, shoes, the largest number of sales were in Hungary, Italy, and Belgium, accounting for over 100 pairs sold in each country. Although, get rid of that comma, although Hungary sold the most, again, grammatically, you cannot use although like this. I really want you to revise some rules about these connectors, whereas, although, and so forth. There are some very specific rules about how to use them. I want you to revise them. You can find them pretty easily, I'm sure, everywhere online or in a very good, in a good grammar book. Excuse me. So, let's see. You could have said, in contrast, Hungary sold the most at around 145 shoe pairs. In the remaining countries, the sales were just above 50, except the UK with exactly 100. All right, let's see. So I just want to make sure that you actually mentioned all of the countries by name, because that's really important. Okay, so the first problem I see is that it looks like you've left out a couple of countries. You haven't even mentioned them by name. We know that you said 9 countries, but we don't know what countries they were. So you never mentioned anything about France. You never mentioned anything about Ireland. I thought you mentioned the other countries. You also didn't mention Holland. This might seem like a detail, but you really have to at least mention these countries by name. Okay? Otherwise, we just know about 6 of the countries, kind of vaguely, but we don't know 3 of them, which is pretty important. I mean, that's like 1/3 of your information. So you've left that out, and that's going to really, really hurt you in terms of task achievement. Okay. Other than that, I thought what you mentioned was okay. I thought honestly that you wrote a little too much in your overview, and I would have liked a little more detail in these paragraphs. Your overview didn't have to focus on so much information, really. I mean, we're talking about the main trends. So just saying that brown shoes were more popular in the countries in question, that would have been fine. Or you could say something that I think is really interesting, that although by and large brown shoes were sold more, the highest figure in the chart belongs to black leather shoes. That also would have been okay. All right. I think that's pretty much it. So go ahead and correct these. Look at the resources that I told you about, just kind of revising how to use although, how to use whereas, and all these linkers. Okay, and of course, correct these essays and send them back to us with your next set. Good luck, and we'll be waiting for them.